else to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
How to use negative space management in graffiti. That's going to be the topic of today's video. This topic tends to be one that's a little bit more abstract and gives people a lot of trouble, so if you want a full comprehensive guide on the topic, we do have this video right here in our Everything You Need to Know About Graffiti playlist. But in today's video, I want to focus on some commonly asked questions about the topic and address some questions that you guys have had since that initial video. And we're going to do that using some actual real examples, starting with this piece I did right here. Let's just turn this into sketch form, and we can begin breaking down exactly how the negative space management works and what it's doing in this piece. But what exactly is negative space? For those of you guys who aren't familiar with the term, negative space is essentially the area that is not being utilized or occupied by something. So for example, my body is positive space, but this air over here that isn't being occupied by anything is negative space. And while in other font-based art forms you have a little terminology known as kerning, which is essentially, the space between two letters or the spacing between two letters, in graffiti we have the term negative space management. And the reason for the differentiation between the two is because graffiti has a lot, and I mean a ton, of exterior details that creates a bunch of negative space that is not related to the individual letters, but rather relates to maybe the 3D or extensions or chips, drop shadow, or things of the sort. And the goal of negative space management is not only to balance the letters, but to balance the name as a whole, which can prevent your piece or your hand styles or even throwies from looking lopsided, looking like they're kind of tumbling over, and just looking overall sloppy. Now, negative space also affects all of the other fundamentals in graffiti. Negative space can play a huge role in letter structure, as well as flow, those being two very pivotal roles that negative space plays. And we can actually see examples of that right here in this piece. So let's go ahead and black that piece out real quick, just so we can focus on the negative space that the letters create themselves. With the piece blacked out, you can very easily distinguish each individual letter. And the reason we're able to differentiate them is because of the negative space that we've built. The issue a lot of graffiti artists run into with their hand styles, throwies, and even their pieces is they go to one extreme or the other. Either their letters have way too much negative space, or their negative space is way too close. In the first extreme, where the negative space is way too far apart, they break the name up, and as a result, each letter looks as its own individual entity as opposed to one individual word. This also essentially just eradicates any hope for flow. And flow is essentially what holds your graffiti together. On the other extreme, where the negative space is way too close, they end up destroying letter structure because the letters overlap way too much. You can't differentiate one letter from another. And this also destroys flow. So while this negative space is typical, this negative space is fundamentally correct, we can see an example of the negative space being way too close. While sure, you can still differentiate certain letters from other letters, you lose a lot of letter structure from the letters being right on top of one another. And if a new graffiti artist makes this a habit, then as they progress and as they move on to more advanced things, this becomes a lot more of an issue. However, this is something that more advanced graffiti artists can do. In the case of an extremely advanced graffiti artist who understands the fundamentals and knows how to balance flow as well as letter structure with negative space management in order to keep all three of those properly done, they can have a really tight negative space and still make it function. We see that most notably in Saber's work. Saber's an absolutely phenomenal graffiti artist who does this to great effect. But this is not easy to do, especially for a more amateur graffiti artist. Your goal as a graffiti artist should be to keep the letters close enough to where they flow with one another, but separated enough in order to build enough letter structure. Now, you'll have to forgive me, this specific piece does utilize some different sizing on the letters very intentionally, but as an amateur graffiti artist just starting off, you would want to keep all of your letters relatively proportioned and roughly the same size. Something a little bit more similar to what this piece is. This will make it a lot easier to manage your negative space, and make it a lot easier to balance weight as well, while not stacking on other obstacles in order for you to worry about. The more you try to stylize things, the more obstacles you put in your way, and as a result, the more likely you are to make mistakes. This is something we want to avoid in our practice. But moving on to a different example, let me show you guys this piece right here. This is another piece I did which uses a lot of negative space and then fills that negative space up in order to deal with weight. You see, one of the big issues with negative space is it can either take away a lot of weight or it can add a lot of weight depending on how it's utilized. In this piece here, if we were to draw an imaginary line straight down the piece, we can then kind of create once again an imaginary seesaw by drawing this horizontal line. Once again, imaginary, right? You don't want to actually draw this on top of your sketch. And we'd find that the piece is pretty balanced, but it's only balanced because we considered the negative space in the sketching process and we planned around it by adding certain extensions and exterior details, so on and so forth. And this becomes really apparent once we actually look at the weight of each individual letter. You'll see that the letters themselves aren't necessarily equal in weight, but the extensions kind of balance that out. So you have the I here, which takes up a huge amount of have room predominantly on the right side of the name over here, and then the M, while it doesn't necessarily take up as much width, it has a lot of height. And we see that once again here on the right hand side of the name. But the G and the R on the other hand, well, these don't really have nearly as much weight. As you can see, compared to the I, it's a little bit lacking, and compared to the M, while it's comparable in width, it's not comparable in height. Very similarly, the G is roughly the same size as the R, so it pretty much lines up to be the same, meaning the right hand side of the name has a lot more weight. So what do? We add more negative space at the bottoms of the letters, which adds weight to that side because it creates anticipation, which is a topic we speak about here, and then we fill that negative space with exterior details and extensions. But if we get rid of all that extra nonsense, you immediately see, alright, well, this doesn't really weigh out with just the letters. A prime example of what I previously mentioned. But there's one more thing to consider. Because of the simple fact that negative space does contain weight, despite the fact that it's emptiness, if you have negative space that's above your letters can help to hold that negative space up. So negative space that's this size above the letters is not as heavy as negative space that's the same exact size below the letters. In essence, this negative space, despite being comparable in size to this one has more weight, and this one has less weight. On the opposite side of the spectrum, positive space that's higher up can very easily have a lot of weight that can help balance things out. And this is because everything that's below this positive space has to actively hold that weight up. Now, on a very basic level for negative space, a newer graffiti artist should really practice balancing the amount of negative space on both the left and the right side of their piece. You really want to make sure that there's about, it doesn't have to be exact, but you want to make sure that there's comparable amounts of negative space between each and every single letter. There should be some form of uniformity to how much negative space is included on each side of your piece. This is easier said than done because some letters naturally have a lot of negative space. Something like a lowercase e may not have nearly as much negative space as something like an uppercase T. And this is where your letter positioning comes into play in order to fill in some of that negative space. Simply moving letters around can really help in order to fill in a lot of those empty areas. Now, something else to keep in mind about negative space is it is necessary. A lot of newer graffiti artists try to completely eradicate it out of their pieces, but you don't want to do this. You want a comfortable amount that allows your letter structures to actually exist. And on top of that, negative space is great for building depth. In fact, you need it to build depth. So if you want 3D, if you want drop shadow, let there be more negative space. That way your 3D and your drop shadow can exist within that area. We can see great examples of that here. We have a fair bit amount of negative space within these letters and negative space around the 3D, which allows the 3D to add depth. If we just mashed out all the negative space and filled it all with 3D, we wouldn't have any depth in this piece. And the same thing goes for your hand styles. Well, I mean, granted, you're not going to be adding 3D to your tags, typically speaking, but you do want negative space there. The last thing you want to do is have your letters right on top of one another and you just end up with one big blob. For throwies, the objective is a little bit different though. The objective is kind of to get rid of as much negative space as possible. Since throwies don't really prioritize depth and they have a really high priority for flow, getting rid of a lot of that negative space in favor of positioning the letters closer together ends up working to the benefit of throwies. This is why in a lot of throwies you'll see a lack of negative space. So next time you're struggling with negative space management, come back to this video and check out some of the tips and tricks for negative space management, and you should have no problem at all. If you guys want a lot more information about negative space and all the fundamentals associated with it, check out the best How to Do Graffiti playlist right up here, with more graffiti content right down here. And if you want a nice and easy way in order to jumpstart your graffiti and make the learning process as easy as humanly possible, pick up one of the books I published in the description down below. And I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thanks for watching.